Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Elaine Barron. I am the president of Esprit Travel, and we're happy to be bringing this to you today. I can tell already we're going to have some slight technical issues since it looks like the screen that I thought would be on is not on. So at some point we'll sort that out, probably with your participation. So that'll be fun. Today, we are going to be learning a little bit more about Japanese gardens from the former president of Esprit, Steve Beimel. A lot of you people that are out there watching this know Steve. He's been with Esprit since 1992 doing trips to Japan. So that is pushing 30 years this year. If we get started, I'd like to introduce Steve. So Steve, why don't you turn on your camera and your microphone. Hi, say hi to everybody.
Hello there.
So I hope we're going to start the presentations. How's the control going? Because that screen doesn't look right.
Okay.
Well, Steve, I'll let you tap dance for the beginning. I was going to talk about a little bit of logistics. So everybody, this is a webinar, which is a little bit different than a Zoom session. It means nobody's on camera, your microphones aren't on, you don't have to worry about any of that. We're going to be presenting on a screen on front of you, a slideshow that Steve's going to be talking to, and you can make that screen a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller as you wish. You have the opportunity, if you'd like to ask questions, in the Q&A section. And we'll be able to answer those either as we go or at the end of the presentation. And then also, if you have, sometimes we'll be offering some commentary, like if there's a Japanese name or something that Steve mentions, Keiko will often put that in the chat just so you know the spelling of it. And right now, Steve, are you in control of that screen? Because we're not seeing the whole thing.
No.
Okay, I think we're going to do something a little interesting here.
So I can speak while you do technical things.
Yeah, I think David's going to have to take it back over again and get that sorted out. So we do have a slideshow. Steve, I'm gonna go off camera and then I can just start talking about your topic.
Okay. So this is a bit surreal. I don't know who's out there. I saw some of the names of people signed up, so I'm hoping that you showed up. As you know, you all know who I am. I've already been introduced. This slideshow is a compilation of maybe 50 years of my life in a way. I came to Japan 50 years ago and fell in love with Japanese gardens. And after that time, I was in the States and I was working in the nursery business, involved with plants and growing plants, and then came back to Japan. And I think we have our control again. And started working in the tour business. Creating the tours, and the first tour I did, and led this tour for many, many years, was a walking tour of the gardens of Kyoto. And this tour that we're doing today is a reflection of, or an example of, what we did on that 11-day tour, walking from garden to garden. So I think this is going to work now. Yes, it's working. Hallelujah. So I'm going to set my clock so I don't talk too much.
All right.
Okay, so we're ready to begin.
He's just starting.
That's great. Great. So this garden that you see before you is in the west part of Japan, in the western Japan, western Kyoto, in the Arashiyama district. And you'll notice this is a garden, and right next to it is the nature which this garden is emulating, which is an interesting thing, because Egyptians and Romans and and continental Europeans created gardens that looked like people made them. And here's a garden that looks like creation made it, like God made it. And so that's a very different approach to creating a garden. We're going to look at that a little bit during this presentation. And today we hope to cover historical and cultural background of the Japanese garden, types of Japanese gardens, because there are many types. The elements, the building blocks that put together a garden, the concepts and techniques which have been developed over, I say 2,000 years, 1,400 years in Japan and 600 years prior to that in China. And then finally, we'll come back to Tenryuji, because Tenryuji, this garden I just showed you, has so many of these elements, so many of these concepts and techniques in it. So it's a great way to wrap things up. The Japanese garden in Japanese is made up of two kanji characters. And the first one, te, brings forth a feeling of the wonders, the wildness of nature. And en, this garden character refers to the pastoral aspects of a Japanese garden, the things that people do, that people build walls, and you can see there's a wall around this character. They build walls, they make fences, they have stepping stones and bridges, and they grow fruit trees and things like that. They plant things. So that's the man-made aspect. And you put them together, it's the wildness of nature and the human element, and it's called teien, and that's a Japanese garden. Before there were actual ornamental gardens that we see today, that we've seen actually for 1,400 years, prior to 1,400 years ago, and who knows when it began, the Japanese garden was actually an area of divine space. And it could have been at the end in a little hamlet or in a group of houses in a village. And it was all over Japan, and they were the original Shinto shrines before there were buildings, before they had any kind of structures. There were areas of gravel or sand, and they were cordoned off by rope. And people would come up to these places, and this is the place where they would commune with God, with their gods, with their spiritual source. And this could be a water area. It could be a tree or a stone that had sacred qualities. And these were divine spaces. And these sand areas, people were not allowed to walk in them. People would not walk in them because they were divine and sacred. So far west of Japan, on the other side of the Sea of Japan, is China. Of course, China, one of the great civilizations in the history of the world. 2,500 years ago, the Chinese became Taoists, and Taoists, as we know, have an obsession with immortality. And they had great interest in herbs that prolong life, and all kinds of acupuncture and all these things that prolong life. And there was a belief that on the east coast of China, there were 5 islands of paradise born on the backs of huge sea turtles. And these paradise islands were so exquisite. They had ponds and rivers and waterfalls and beautiful white animals everywhere, and gorgeous flowers. And it was believed that on these islands were living immortal beings. And just as some of us are European descent, just as Europeans were looking for El Dorado in the land of immortality in the New World, the Chinese were looking for these islands. They were always looking for them. They could never find them. And finally, 2,000 years ago, in the Han Dynasty, one emperor decided, if we can't find the lands of the immortals and where those immortal people live and travel back and forth to China on the backs of white cranes, if we can't find those islands, let's create in our own compounds exquisite bits of paradise in order to bring those immortal beings to us. So this is the first time people were in Asia were creating ornamental gardens. And then 500-600 years later, when the Japanese were sending educational missions to China to learn various aspects of culture, they saw these gardens, they were very impressed by them, and they brought the idea back to Japan, and they placed the garden in the Imperial Palace of Japan. So they took this idea of the land of the immortals, and they combined it with their own concept of divine space in the gravel or sand areas, and they hybridized it, and it became the Japanese garden. Initially, for the first few hundred years, Japanese gardens very much imitated Chinese topography. But it wasn't, by about the 1400s, the Japanese began to look to their own natural climate and topography to inspire the way they built gardens. So at that time, the stones became much lower and smaller than they had been earlier. Of the many different kinds of Japanese gardens, we'll speak about the 6 main ones, from scroll garden to pocket garden. A scroll garden gets its name from the word scroll, which is, if you could imagine a narrative scroll, which is rolled, it's a narrative scroll with a painting and various poetry and descriptions on it. And it's rolled out from right to left. And you view this scroll from a seated position in the same way you would see a scroll garden. The garden is seen from approximately 6 feet or 2 meters back from the veranda through these posts, which become a kind of frame. And the concept is known as 10,000 trees at one glance. So everything you see is everything you will see. There's nothing hidden that will be revealed in the scroll garden. A strolling garden is a completely different concept. You see various things, scenes, elements as you walk through, and your path is orchestrated. So as you walk through the garden, you see this, then you don't see that. This is hidden, this is revealed. So this hide and reveal concept, it's this mini magical mystery tour as you walk through. And of course, gardens changed from day to day, from hour to hour. So no matter when you walk through a scroll garden, depending on the light, depending on the season, depending on the weather, it will be different. A paradise garden is very closely aligned with Buddhism. You'll see this in many Buddhist temples. It's a place that will give you a visceral or kinesthetic feeling of what the other side is like, what heaven is like. And nothing says this more than the Moss Temple in Kyoto. Those of you who have been there, I think this picture will bring back that memory. It's just 5 acres of impeccably manicured scenery in this lush green environment. The dry garden, sometimes it's called the Zen garden, but actually the word Zen garden was coined by an American journalist about 100 years ago. The true term is dry mountains and water garden. And this became popular in the late 1500s. And the dry garden gave a couple of things. It gave us an opportunity to build gardens where there was no source of water for a pond. So it allowed us to have more and more gardens in many different places. It also was popular amongst the Zen sect, followers of Zen, because when you look at real water, it's very easy to feel moved by that. But a sand garden, you have to go inside of yourself to find that source of water. So it makes you work a little bit, so it has this meditative, contemplative quality that appealed to the Zen sect. A tea garden, as you see here, this tea garden and tea gardens like this became popular in the late 1500s. And that was through the influence of the great tea master, Sen no Rikyu. And any of you who've been on tours with me know that I speak about Sen no Rikyu just ad infinitum. I speak about him all the time. He's probably one of the most important figures in Japanese cultural history. And he gave us the way of tea as we know it today, the tea ceremony. He gave us concepts like wabi-sabi. He gave us the beautiful presentation of food and the tea garden, the rusticity of Sukiya style architecture, which we see influencing architecture all over the world today. So the tea garden is not splashy. There are very few flowers in the garden. You don't have much of a view. It's intended to bring you inside of yourself. It's intended to create a sense of intimacy and contemplation and introspection. Pocket garden was a popular element used in urban architecture in the Edo, which is now Tokyo, or in Kyoto, Osaka areas, where there was dense housing and very little room for gardens and green. The pocket garden not only gave people an opportunity to have a little green in their house, but it also allowed for greater airflow, sunshine in the house. These are the building blocks, the basic building blocks of a garden, and we'll go through each point from streams to human elements. Adding a stream to a garden really brings a touch of magic to the garden. As water moves in such a way that creates sound and the movement is visible, which is important. The movement is visible and you can hear the water moving. It really touches us. It brings a greater sense of relaxation and a sense of warmth and intimacy. You can see in this garden that the plants used around the water are actual plants that would grow naturally in a river area, which makes it more believable. Also, in a mountain scene in a garden, you would use plants that you would normally see in a mountain. You notice that you can't see the stream completely from this position. There's no place where you could see the stream in its entirety. From every angle or viewing point, part of it is hidden, which adds a sense of mystery. Whatever we can't see, it allows our own imaginations to work to become fruitful and to become part of it. We actually add to the garden design ourselves in our imaginations. Rather than making things obvious, things are not obvious. And that's one of the great techniques of the Japanese garden, creating that sense of mystery. Waterfalls are very important, again, for the sound and the visual, of course, of the water falling, but the sound is very important. And it creates a lot of mist or a lot of moisture, and that creates an atmosphere of its own as well. You could see that each waterfall is a different quality of the way it flows. For example, this would be a technique called a silk cloth falling over the side of a table. So it's very even flowing. But this next one would be more like a skein of yarn falling over a table. And so it's a great deal of attention is placed to the lip stone, LIP, the lip stone, which will which will control the way the water flows and according to the way the designer wants. The water hits that stone on the bottom. It's called the water breaking stone, which is also creates splashing and a very nice sound and a very nice effect. This is a dry waterfall, and this particular garden is a miniaturization of a scene. These dry waterfalls, these dry gardens, were inspired by ink paintings. So these are actually three-dimensional ink paintings. And this became popular in the late 1400s. This particular garden is from the mid-1500s. And the choice of stones and the way things are arranged are so impeccably, and I don't like to use the word perfect, but it's about as perfect as you can get. The bridge is very tiny and low, which makes everything seem much bigger. Even the choice of camellias, the green of camellias have a bit of bluish green in it, and so they create a much more dynamic background than leaves without that bluishness in them. Islands are important because they make a pond seem much larger than it is. If you ever moved your furniture out of your house or out of a room that once had furniture in it, then didn't have furniture in it, was surprisingly much smaller than we remember. I think we all have that experience. And so when you go to see a model house, they put furniture in the house because it makes it look bigger. And that's what islands do. Of course, stone placement is probably the most important part of a Japanese garden, is stone placement. The most difficult job is to place a stone so it looks as if it's been there forever. So it looks like nature placed it there. So of course, we have to have stones that are similar. We have to choose stones that are similar in quality and color and shape and texture. And also the angles of the stones. I mean, if nature was wearing a stone down from one direction for 2 million years, you wouldn't turn that stone on its side because it would look very unnatural. So the angles, the way the stones are placed, and the way that each stone relates to the next stone near it and around it, and in the whole arrangement is very important. And only the people with the greatest experience and ability are ever allowed to place these stones, wherever chosen to place these stones. Usually a person with at least traditionally at least 10 years of experience and apprenticeship. The pavilion is a prominent aspect of the Chinese garden, and in Japan it's usually a tea house. The pavilion is a place, is a building. In China, it's a building from which to view something, but in Japan, it's more of a place to view, a building that we see from the other side of the pond, as it is in China as well. But in Japan, it's always something that's very, it's very remote looking. There's a sense of rusticity, of distance. So when you look at this, it takes you in your imagination to a far off place that's kinder, that's calmer, that's quieter. Bridges are a very important part of a garden. You notice how the whole scene here draws us, and I'm using my cursor here, it draws us to this area beyond the bridge. So this would be a focal point. The most important places to view gardens and the best place to take pictures, take photos in a Japanese garden are from the sides of bridges. Not that it's not beautiful from other angles, but these are areas that are totally set up for us. They're composed pictures for us. So when we take a picture from the side of the bridge, we're almost guaranteed that it'll be an interesting picture. And so what is beyond this bridge? This is the question that the placing of this bridge asks us, what's beyond there? And so we don't quite see what's beyond there, but we know that it must be something special. We think that this goes on forever and ever. So it gives us a greatly expanded sense of space. And so the area beyond the bridge is always this place of mystery. Here we have a bridge placed very low to the water, as in that previous picture. Placing it very low and making it look small allows us to emphasize that which is beyond it, to make it look even bigger than it really is, and farther away as well. You notice these are natural stone bridges. Of course, everyone would want a natural stone bridge, but there aren't that many. It's very difficult to find a stone shaped like this. So when you find a stone shaped like a bridge, it's really very valuable. Otherwise, we have to resort to a cut stone bridge, which is very nice, but not nearly as nice or as evocative as a stone bridge. Stepping stones are devices which take us through different environments. And if you look at the stepping stones in this picture, these square pieces of stone placed in this picture, it has a very random, very spontaneous, very free look to it. It's not 10 stones in a perfect line, but they're random, and they're just almost haphazardly placed, and which is a very 20th century concept of this freedom of expression. This garden was built in the early 1600s, and they were already showing this kind of spontaneity, which we Westerners call modernism or contemporary, but in Japan, it's just the way things have always been. Sometimes I remember I had a conversation with a young person speaking about an extraordinary looking tea bowl, which was so contemporary looking. And she said, yeah, that looks like something my grandmother would have. So for her, that the contemporary look that I was so impressed by was just something that was so part of her culture that it wasn't even that remarkable to her. Natural stones are used, as well as cut stones in a garden, to take us through different areas. And oftentimes cut stones are used in a more formal area, and natural stones are used in a more informal area. Not always, though. There's a concept called mitate, which means taking something that was old, that was formerly used, and bringing it into something new for historic continuity. So these are stepping stones that were once foundation stones of a building, but they were placed in this garden as stepping stones in this pond for that sense of historic continuity. Gates are very important because they are not only they define the entrance, but they also will define when there are two different areas in a garden which are very different, that defines that transition area. And of course, fences, bamboo or other natural elements are very common in Japanese gardens, especially these natural fences, which became even more popular after the advent of the tea movement in the late 1500s. And Japanese are superb builders of walls. This particular wall is a mud wall, a clay wall into which roof tiles were placed, old roof tiles that just stuck into the wall like this, and it gives us this wonderful texture. And the human element. So if you think about a painting, an Asian painting, a Chinese, Korean, or Japanese painting, traditionally, in a landscape painting, you always see a little tiny woman and man walking up a hill, or a man in a boat going down the river, or a woman on the side of the river fishing or something. You'll see people in these pictures. And even though the human beings are a very tiny part of the overall composition, just seeing a person in the painting will tell us in subconsciously that, yes, I can go in that picture. And so we see a person in there, we'll immediately see ourselves in the painting itself. In the same way, that human element is used in a Japanese garden. So especially in a scroll garden where you're sitting and looking at the garden, invariably there'll be a bridge, there'll be a basin, a water basin. There'll be something that will tell you, I can go in there. Here's a water well. You'll often see water wells in the gardens of people who practice the way of tea. Another water basin. This boat stone is placed in a garden where there's a narrative theme. So you see that the gravel is placed there in the form of water flowing. So we sit on the veranda, we see ourselves get on the boat, and we float down to the sea of love and mercy. Stone lanterns are ubiquitous in Japanese gardens. There are 250 styles, 250, get this, 250 styles of Japanese stone lanterns, and they're functional. You can place candles in them at night, and they create a magical environment. Another water basin for washing our hands. Post-support roof, floor to ceiling windows. We're getting into the technique and concept section now. And so in this building, this is a very good example of an architectural feature which allows us to have the garden as part of the house. Because the posts support the roof and not the walls, you can remove the walls completely, and then the garden is built right next to the house, and the garden and the house become one. So I remember I spoke with the wife of the abbot of this temple, and she said that, we have this garden, we don't need it to put lots of things on the walls for decorations, because with a garden like this, it's just completely unnecessary. It makes a lot of sense. So this architectural feature predates Western floor-to-ceiling windows by hundreds and hundreds of years. The veranda, or the engawa in the Japanese building, is a very important concept. It's very, very functional. When we look at the building from the garden, the veranda looks like part of the house. But when we look at the garden from the building, the veranda looks like it's part of the garden, or a stepping stone into the garden. The veranda is very versatile. This room here in the winter can be divided into smaller rooms by paper doors, and the veranda becomes a corridor. And the veranda will have paper doors on both sides, both walls, so that it creates insulation. In the time before glass windows, that was the way they would insulate a room. And so the sun shines through the paper doors into the corridor, into the veranda, and that heats up, and that becomes a way of insulating the house from cold. The dimensions can intensify our appreciation and improve or promote intimacy. So if you're sitting on the veranda on the left side, and your garden is this big white square, your experience will not be nearly as powerful as if you were sitting in a garden on the right side, where the garden was shaped such that the garden had the dimensions of being very wide but not very deep. So if it's wide but not very deep, everything comes forward and becomes more intense. If everything is spread out in a square, yes, you could see it. Yes, it's going to be pleasant, but it won't be nearly as powerful. Here's an example of this very long, narrow garden, not very deep, but very wide. And here's an example of a contemporary garden. This is on one of the poshest streets in Tokyo, and it was designed by one of Japanese most prominent artists, photographers, and architects, Hiroshi Sugimoto. And it's a restaurant. So you see the garden here on the left and the restaurant on the right. It's a very small space, but when you're sitting in the restaurant, you have this long but not very deep garden, and it's a very powerful presentation when you're sitting in this room. It's your focus is very much tightened. Framing heightens our experience via intensifying our focus, which is what we were just talking about. And so if you can imagine yourself standing on top of a mountain, you're standing on top of a mountain and you have a 180-degree view of everything. So your eyes are going far and near and far and near. And it's very tiring, and it's an exalting feeling. It's beautiful, it's fantastic, but you really don't see anything in an intense way. You see the macro. But if you look through the lens of a camera, you start to see exquisite little scenes everywhere you look. In the same way, in a garden, if you have a window to look through, a gate, a door to look through, that's narrows your view to 60 degrees, it intensifies your view and makes it much more powerful. So if you're sitting on the veranda in this garden, beautiful as it may be, it's not nearly as powerful as if you sit inside about 6 feet back from the veranda. So those of you who've been on tours with me know that I force everybody to at least try sitting inside and looking back, looking through that. Transitions are very important. They really expand our sense of time. If you look at a site, for example, like this is in Daitokuji in Kyoto. If you start in the street where there's chaos in the world, so you go from the street, if you go directly into a very, very informal garden, of course, it'll be beautiful and it'll be wonderful to go into the garden, but it won't be nearly as powerful of an experience than if you were to go through an orchestrated stepping down of your experience. So you start with the chaos and you come to a formal area, then you go to a semi-formal area, and then to the informal area. And when you get there, you'll feel like you've traveled someplace to get there. And it'll just be much more a monumental entry. And so we start here in the formal area, and it's said that when you go from A to B, the more experiences you could have during that, from going from A to B, the farther you will feel like you've walked. So I'm going to take you through this experience, and I'm going to describe what the experiences are. So one experience that you'll subconsciously record is that you're turning a corner. Another experience is you're seeing something different. You're walking down a corridor. These are all experiences. And then you turn again. You see something different, another experience. You go from wide to narrow, from light to dark. You go up a step, you go through a gate. Each of these are experiences. You see something new. You turn, you see something different, another experience. The turning is another experience. You walk down this corridor. This corridor is relatively undetailed, so there's a very mild sense or very subtle sense of monotony because you're not seeing a lot of details as you walk down this corridor. So that extends your sense of time. We turn again, another view. We go from shady to dappled sunlight. We go from wide to narrow, light to dark, up a step, through a gate. We turn again, see something different. That's our destination. That beyond there is where we're going. And we get a window, a glimpse of where we're going, so that our transition is smoother. And voila, we end up in the informal garden. And if I were to ask you the next day how far you traveled or how long it took you to go from the street to this inner garden, because you're not consciously analyzing it, just subconsciously, you just had the sense of it, you'd probably say, oh, it took 15 minutes, but it actually only took 2 or 3 minutes. The scroll garden, foreground, middle ground, and background, reduces the need for refocusing. So this is at Nanzenji at the head priest, the head abbot's quarters. So we're looking at the garden from the side. So I'm going to be bringing you to the right side there, where you'll see the veranda, and we're going to be sitting down. So now we're sitting there down here, and we're looking at this garden. The idea is that with a foreground, middle ground, and background, you can concentrate all of the area which you want people to mainly focus on into a small area, which will reduce the need to focus the eyes. Now, this is starting from the late 1500s. People who designed scroll gardens realized that you want to minimize eye refocusing because it's tiring. So you look at this garden, your eyes just sail over that gravel area. You go immediately to the green moss area. And that which is beyond the wall there is the background. Now, of course, if you don't live in Japan, you haven't been here very often, the tile roofs will attract your attention, but realize that this is made for Japanese people who saw when this building was built, they saw tile roofs every day. So that's not going to attract their attention. When people look at this garden, they're going to be looking at this. Okay, there. When people look at this garden, let's see if I get this video to work here. They just look at that narrow band. And the name of this garden is the Garden of the Leaping Tiger. So you can imagine this beautiful animal just running from left to right. There's a nice left to right movement there, and just jumping over that wall in slow motion. Of course, that's my interpretation. Transparency and layering expand the sense of distance. So if I'm standing outside of, this is a relatively small building. I'm standing outside of the building and I'm looking through one room to, I see doors, I see another room, I see another door, I see a veranda, and I see a garden. All those layers between me and that tree create a great sense of distance. And it makes the house seem much bigger. So if you have a small house, you can increase the way people perceive the house, increase the size of that by layering. Layering is seen here in this garden here, this pond garden. So one layer between you and this tree here in the background, which is our destination, so to speak, for our eyes. We see a layer of water here. We see a bridge. We see another layer of water here. We see a stone. We see some reflections, more stones, another bridge, and then we see that tree. If none of this existed, but only that tree, it would seem very close, but this sets us up for distance. The same thing here. Now, the backdrops of a garden help to define the site. So in this case, in Tenyuji, they dug out when they created the pond, they dug out the dirt, they placed it on the far shore, they planted trees in there, and that berm became the backdrop of the garden. Here in this garden, the focus is on what's inside the garden, not what's beyond it. So they made a very clear delineation between this space and what's beyond with that mud wall. In this garden, we have a white background, and this garden is very reminiscent of the monochromatic ink paintings, where you have mountain peaks which are bathed in clouds and mist. So you have the white wall behind these stones, and it's reminiscent of those ink paintings. This garden is a relatively small garden, but it happens to be next door to a forest. So by placing a hedge here at the edge of the garden instead of a wall, you just naturally incorporate what's beyond that hedge into your definition of where this garden is. So you think this garden goes on forever and ever. Now, in this particular garden, it's a very powerful image of these two mounds. And in the background, you have just simple hedges just to screen out the buildings beyond there without a lot of competition. Vectors, site-directing vectors, you can think of these as natural arrows. So for example, in this picture of a waterfall, this is in the Gold Pavilion, the Kinkakuji in Kyoto. It looks like it's been there forever. Why does this look like it's so solid? The reason is, if you look at the vectors, on the right side, the stones go from right to left, and the arrow meets up about here. On the left side, it goes for this stone is at an angle, and this vector goes up to about here. So the right stone vector and the left stone vector meet above the waterfall. And then the waterfall, the water's going down. So we have this shape, which is a pyramid, and there's nothing more powerful for the human psyche, nothing that seems more solid than a pyramid. So when we look at this waterfall, we just sense this strength of this pyramid. Incidentally, this stone here, which is at a slight angle, it's a very interesting metaphor here. It's believed that at the head of the Yellow River in China, there was or is a waterfall known as the Dragon's Gate. And it was believed that if a carp could swim up that massive, massive waterfall to the top, it's such an extraordinary effort that carp would become a dragon in heaven. And so this kind of encouragement was seen in this stone. The stone in this position was an encouragement for people to give it all you've got. So in China, this Dragon's Gate carp was used to inspire people taking the very difficult government examinations to become high-level civil servants. The whole basis of the Confucian educational system. But in Japan, you see these in Zen temples, which is telling those Zen monks to just give it all you've got, really go for enlightenment. Bridges have, more often than not, will have a stone on the right side and the left side, an anchor stone. And if you look at this, the anchor stone is a very powerful vertical element. And if you have a powerful vertical element, you have something coming out of it, the vector goes right out of that to the left. And then there's another stone here, which we can't see, where the vector comes to the right. And then you have the same thing here. This is setting up two bridges that look really powerful, and it brings our eye directly to this tree here and to the quote unquote other side of that evocative area on the other side of that bridge. Just sets us up for that. In the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto, we have this, imagine yourself, you're sitting on the veranda or inside of the temple and you're looking out at this. So you have in the background, you have pine trees and cryptomeria cedars. And if with pines and cryptomerias, the lower boughs and branches are very far apart, but the higher you go in the tree, the closer the branches are growing together. So when you look at a tree and you look up, it seems much bigger than it is because of that forced perspective created by the illusion of having closer branches at the top and farther ones at the bottom. And so when we look at the trees in the back, our eyes go up. When we look at the trees in the middle ground, these are red pines, which grow flat and squatty. We're trained to look, it trains our eyes, or it brings our eyes to the left and the right. Expansiveness. So you have height in the back, expansiveness in the middle, and in the front, you have this sand sculpture, which is like a runway. It just takes us very deep inside. And the effect is like a cathedral. It's an feeling of this exaltation, breadth, and depth. Stone, we could talk for hours or days probably on stone arrangements. I just chose a couple really simple ones just to give you an example. One kind of a classic arrangement would be 3 stones. You have the large stone here, which is the yang stone, as in yin and yang. And as we know, every man and every woman has within them both elements of the male and the female principle in Eastern philosophy. So you have the yang stone, which is wisdom, it's leadership, it's the great sage. On the right side, and down here, you have the flat stone, which is the yin stone. It's the feminine principle. It's solidity. It's gives birth. It's calmness. It's peaceful. So you have, when you have a big, powerful stone like this on the left, and you have the very calm and solid on the right. These two together, they complement each other in the most beautiful way. And one without the other is not nearly as powerful as the two together. The third stone would be the human stone. And humans, we're always seeking to be the great mother or the great father, but we usually fall short of that. Oops. So sometimes that's called the heaven and earth stone. Sometimes it's called the yin and yang stone. But depending on, by the way, this is from David Slosson's book. He's the Secrets of Japanese Gardens. I highly recommend it. It's one of the Bibles that I've been using for the past 30 years. And you'll see that again in this scene. This is a very small image, a small arrangement. The stone on the left is the human stone, and the center stone, which is the let's say the father stone or the yang stone. They have their backs to each other. They're looking in different directions, which gives us a sense of expansiveness. But it also sets up a tension between the two stones, which is it gives it it makes it more interesting. If all the stones are looking exactly in the same direction, it's not very interesting. Here's another example of that, where this stone here would be the master stone, and the other stones here are, every stone in here is placed to be an obeisance to that master stone. Japanese are masters at aesthetic pruning. You see this, the pine tree is pruned in a way that allows light to come through. It removes anything that's extraneous. Only the most important elements are left, so we can enjoy that beautiful structure of the tree. It gives us a sense of transparency. We can see through it, so it's not so claustrophobic and dark with an untrimmed tree would be. In this scene, all these plants, except for a few, most of the plants are geometrically trimmed. We only have a few that are aesthetically trimmed, so there's very little competition. If every tree was trimmed like a work of art, it would be so busy that it would be tiring. Here are plants. These are Satsuki azaleas, which are planted in 5 or 6 at a time, and they grow together into these mounds to be mountain-like. So borrowed scenery. Again, we have 10 views. We have the background, which becomes part of the scenery, part of the garden. Here we have a mountain behind this garden. So instead of having a wall here, we have a hedge, so that the mountain behind there becomes part of the garden. And then in this scene, we want to hide the building beyond these trees. So we use trees to screen out things. If you have a 7-Eleven next to your garden, you can plant trees to get rid of it. If you have a mountain, you allow the mountain to come into your garden. So it's very flexible. Narrow and widening. So when you look at the stream, it looks like it's really, we're sitting on a veranda, excuse me, we're sitting on under a trellis and we're looking at this stream. It looks very far away, but why does it look so far away when it really isn't very far away at all? One thing is that you would expect the stream to be shaped like a long rectangle, but in actuality, it's purposely shaped like a triangle. So the head of the water, where the waterfall is very narrow. The place that's closest to us, this waterfall down here, is very wide. So it's forced perspective. And then we have 3 waterfalls, which is layering. More layering comes in with the zigzag of the stream, not only zigzagging, but the stream itself widens and narrows, which creates even more sense of distance. Finally, by placing these 3 stones, the A, B, C stone, A and B are about the same size, but C is much smaller. But you assume C is the same size, but it's only it's so far away, it seems smaller. So when we look at the stream, it's in a very small area, it looks really huge. And so finally, we can, by trimming trees to look like they're fully grown to their maximum height of maturity, but they're actually small trees. We assume that they're big trees, but they're far away because they just seem small, and which makes the gold pavilion seem much larger and more prominent. Oops. So now we're back to Tenryuji. And just to bring together everything we've seen so far, we see the borrowed scenery. We have the natural backdrop of the garden. We have the dimensions of this garden are very, very wide, but not very deep, 175 by 100. We have the sand in the front. Where are we going? Okay. We have the sand in the front, which is a reference to defined space. We have that sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. So the sand and the water are the foreground, and our eyes just sail over that. We go directly to the middle ground, which is that area where here on the right, where there's a bridge. I'm going to go to the next. Okay, so this area here would be the middle ground. The bridge is the human element. It's placed very low, so it makes it seem very far away. We have this island here, which is a reference to the islands of the immortals in Chinese, in Taoism. And then we have a manipulation of stone size. We have these stones here are actually smaller than we would imagine. So it makes it look farther away. And something interesting here on the right side here, you see very little, the stones are very, very tiny. You can almost not see them at all. And in our subconscious, we look at that and of course, we're not consciously analyzing, but we say, oh, it's so far away. I couldn't even see the stones. And then the stones are all consistent in size, in color, in texture, and shape. And you notice how these stones protrude and recede. So it looks very believable. So if I were to ask you, where is the focal point? If you're looking at 180 degrees, you'll probably eventually find it. This is the focal point. But if you go inside and you look through the frame, the focal point is so obvious. So framing is very important here in this Tenryuji. And you can see through every door, you'll see a magnificent view. And of course, the use of the veranda throughout as our stepping stone into the veranda. Now, if you look at the shape of the pond at Tenryuji, if the pond were shaped like this, it would seem very much smaller. It would seem like maybe a large swimming pool, or maybe a little bit bigger than that. It would seem much smaller than it is. But because you have the undulating shorelines throughout, you have peninsulas and islands, which add to that sense of size, as we mentioned before. And because the water goes out of these inlets, the island goes out of these inlets where the pink arrows are. We don't know where the water's going. We see it going around a corner. We assume it's going on forever and ever. And finally, the variation in the shorelines we have, where there's yellow, it's plants and grasses. So we have plants and grasses with the black or with stones. This variation increases the sense of distance and size. If you had the same stone arrangement going around the pond like a pearl, like a necklace of pearls, it would seem much smaller in comparison. So today we looked at the historical and cultural background. We looked at types of Japanese gardens, basic elements, concepts and techniques, and we came back to Tenryuji, and that where everything just came together. And I think that will give us just one, maybe hopefully a pretty package of the general sense of the Japanese garden. And this is very, very, very much Japanese garden 1A. I mean, we could, this could be a series of about 20 lectures, but I think this is an overview, and I hope you enjoyed it.
I had the same thought, Steve. I was thinking, oh, so now the next lecture will be. Okay, so thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been just a really fascinating deep dive into the history and the aesthetics of Japanese gardens. I'm going to now try to cover a little bit of the bases that we were